Awesome. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and yeah, welcome back to another CarbonCurious webinar. So in this webinar, we've got Sam Gibson here, aka SamTheTrapMan, who is back to serve up some practical pest control advice, but this time regarding deer and how to best control them. The last episode we did with Sam was more about the smaller pests. So if you did miss out on that one, I'd highly recommend jumping on our website and watching it, as it was super insightful and interesting. So yeah, my name is Jimmy Mackay. I'm an account manager for CarbonCrop, and I'm also a keen conservationist and hunter. So I'm excited to be collaborating with Sam, who has a wealth of knowledge in this sector. So yeah, Sam, for the people that don't know, I'll let you give yourself a quick introduction and a bit about your background.
Kia ora koutou. I am a conservationist, a hunter, and I just live in the bush trapping and living the dream, really. And I guess my orientation to deer control is I'm a hunter primarily, but secondly, I came up through the Department of Conservation with some really interesting people with some amazing skill sets in deer control. So I was fortunate to do a couple of years under the Legion Norm Macdonald, and he's responsible for just about like 90% of the ungulate eradication throughout the world. And so I've sucked a lot of his brains and formulate a few ideas on deer control myself.
Oh, wicked. Well, yeah, we're so lucky to have you and your knowledge to come on board and help with this, because yeah, obviously not everyone has that knowledge. So yeah, super stoked to have you on board with us, Sam. Cool. So yeah, so we've already got some pre-submitted questions for this webinar that we'll get to down the track. However, if you've got any questions as we move forward, just don't hesitate to press that wee Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer them live. But if we can't get to them, we'll just email you directly with your answers. So yeah, definitely ask more questions. The more questions, the better for us. Cool. So a little bit about CarbonCrop. Yeah, so together with landowners around the world, we're on a mission to pull 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it up in trees. And we're particularly focused on native planting and reforestation. So how do we fit in? So we offer a free land assessment to assess the forest on your land. If the landowner decides to move forward, we'll cover everything from mapping, report writing, evidence gathering, registering the forest to the emissions trading scheme, emissions returns, and all the ongoing compliance. It's mostly all remote, so you don't have to worry about upfront costs, and it's a win-win because we don't get paid till you do. This is all so the landowner can focus on what they do best, managing their land, and depending where you are in New Zealand, it could include a lot of pest control. Cool. So just a few stats for you here. Only 17% of forests currently registered in the emissions trading scheme are native, and 80% of what CarbonCrop has registered is native. So we're not only on track to make a real difference, but we're also helping landowners diversify incomes and support biodiversity by being recognised. So yeah, some pretty cool stuff there. And leading on from that last slide, you can see that we get more native forests recognised using our tech with 81% acceptance rate compared to 24% for everyone else. So we help you get more carbon credits for your forests in the ETS. Yeah, so as the ETS is a fairly new and large, a large amount of the publicity it's had in the recent years has come from exotic and radiata. So we often get asked this question: can native trees be registered? The answer is absolutely. If the trees meet the ETS criteria, which is at least 1 hectare, 30 meters average width, will reach at least 5 meters at maturity, established after 1989 and are not fruit or nut trees, they can certainly be registered. So if you're unsure, but you think you may have eligible forest in your land, I'd strongly recommend jumping on our website and just applying for a free land assessment. So by now, you've probably heard enough of my voice. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand you over to Sam, and he's got some cool slides that he's put together for us. So yeah, when you're ready, Sam, go for it.
Awesome. So we'll roll through a few slides. And what we'd like to do is take you through, firstly, the value of deer control for short-term biodiversity in your forest, that establishment phase of your forests, why it's really important to keep deer under wraps. And then after that, we'll talk about your long-term value of deer control, because we know that right now, we get one carbon credit throughout all of our native forest systems, but we've also had it indicated to us that as these carbon credits progress, there's a good chance that there will be a differentiation between, low sequestration with the likes of Kanuka and really high sequestration for those massive old growth forests that you guys are hoping to grow. And then after that, we yarn about some of the soil stabilization and how to increase productivity of those forest systems that you're growing. And then we'll roll into some tools. But I just want to start by saying there's two key principles, I reckon, in deer control. And one is that one tool is never the best answer. It's really important to roll through multiple tools and roll through multiple methodologies, because that's how we get the best outcome for deer. And the other thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is that many of us in our generation have come out of a generation where recreational hunting has been an accepted way of doing deer control. But since then, we've discovered through a bunch of studies that a small amount of deer in our forest ecosystem can actually have a massive impact. And the reason that is because deer are like little kids. If we give little kids a free reign of our cupboard or our freezer, they're going to go through and they're going to eat all the ice cream first, and then they're going to move down and eat all the blueberries, and then maybe go down and eat your mixed vegetables. And deer are the same. They're going to eat those most palatable species out, which oftentimes are our highest sequestration species, and then they'll move their way down the palatability ladder, if that makes sense. So we'll grab that. So what happens if we don't control deer in our native forest system is that we get a low productivity system full of softwoods that are going to be your lowest sequestration species over time. So what we find is that if we can implement deer control at the start, we actually start to develop a diverse forest system, and that diverse forest system includes your species such as tōtara and kahikatea and kodi, all these amazing large species that, come 50 years' time, are going to be the ones that are going to be sequestering the most carbon. If we don't do any deer control, we'll end up with some form of monoculture or a biculture of species. Oftentimes in the North Island, we'll find tawa and hoheria, which aren't really that palatable to deer, but they're also a soft species that grow quickly and then fall over and don't sequester in those later years of your forest as much carbon as they probably should. The same goes for beech and kanuka. They're really short-term species, which is great to help establish your forest. But if you don't do that deer control, you're never going to get past that establishment phase into a forest that's really sequestering as much carbon as it possibly can.
Yeah.
And that long sequestration is all about keeping on top of your deer and your possums, because that encourages the large podocarps to grow. And that is what I believe anyway, and I'm going out on a limb and saying this, but I reckon that detail is going to come in our carbon in our ETS system, where we start to recognize these big podocarps is actually sequestering more carbon than Kanuka in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's going underneath the canopy as well, Sam.
Absolutely. That mid and sub canopy is really productive as well. And that's what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah.
And that's, I like to call that, we've got this this beautiful word hoodoo hoodoo, which means the covering of the land. And so it can mean like the down here of a bird. And the hoodoo hoodoo layer is what I like to talk about, because the hoodoo hoodoo layer is a very overlooked and an incredibly important part of our forest structure, because it's the fern species on the forest floor and those small shrubs, and they actually catch and retain the soil, which means that you get a deeper layer of humus, that means that you've got much more productivity for those large tree species to draw down nutrients and grow faster, which sequesters carbon faster. So those fern species and that lower layer to your canopy, and as well as your mid and your sub canopy, they're actually storing water, storing soil, and storing nutrients. So they're incredibly important, but that's the layer that deer find incredibly palatable. And interestingly, that's also the layer that the birds find a lot of their food in, and also ourselves as people, if we are interested in having that connection and that relationship with our forests, that's where we can forage much of our food from as well, because we eat the same food as the deer. So that's the biggest thing that I think is overlooked as far as deer control, is that we're actually retaining our soils from which our forests grow from. We've got better soils, our trees grow faster. If they grow faster, they sequester carbon more quickly.
Absolutely. And it's obvious to see that when you walk through a forest that's got a big population of deer or goats, compared to zero. It's crazy, isn't it?
Makes for easy hunting though, eh, Jimmy? Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's just us talking about this slide's just about us harvesting that same food that the deer do.
Yeah.
We just carry on.
Looks good though.
Tasty, fella. So this photo here is of my grandfather. My grandfather used to hunt on a lot of properties, and he was of that generation where we thought, as a nation, we had smaller deer herds. Right now, we're starting to see a real spike in our deer herds. It's not uncommon for us up here in Tairāwhiti to see 300 deer on a farm in a morning. Really, really common occurrence. But back then, in my grandfather's generation, they were managing small mobs of deer that were having a smaller impact. So recreational hunting at that time could keep a lid on it. It's not the case for most of the country now.
Wow, 300 deer. It's
It's
crazy.
pretty outrageous, eh?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is a lot of our farmers are noticing that. And they're actually losing like 12% of their on-farm productivity when it comes to grass. But deer that are eating grass also, they need a diversity in their diet. If they can get it, they'll eat a lot of native vegetation as well out of our bush blocks, because they're like us. They practice rongoa, so they will eat their fill of grass, but they also need to eat those species out, like the kawakawa and the horapitoids and the koromiko, etc., out of those bush blocks to bring them into a healthy state of being as well. So the interesting thing here is that this group of people, they're actually harvesting on farm for pet food. And so we have them, and they're shooting around 30 animals a morning over the last couple of weeks off one of our farms. And you might think that's a large amount of deer, but when you're talking about seeing 300, which probably means there's about 1,000 present, that's quite a small number. And so these guys we often think that the pet food guys and the meat trade are really good tools for managing deer in our forests. But what we find is they're really good tools at knocking out that first percentage. But once it becomes difficult to hunt and those deer become educated with a helicopter, those guys are going to stop coming back because it's not productive for them to turn up. So they're a good tool to start with. But then what we need to understand is we need to keep knocking the deer further down, because even a small amount of deer on farm are going to have a big impact in our bush blocks as well.
Yeah, so I mean, and I guess this is what we're talking about today, but going forward, when those deer do get cunning and wise, moving forward, what's your kind of next step?
I mean, ideally for me, there's a perfect slide. So ideally for me, if money's no issue, I'd put up a deer fence. I'd shoot everything I can, put up the deer fence around our bush blocks. Some people choose to do the whole farm, but that gets quite expensive. But if we can get a deer fence around our bush block, and then we can shoot out the interior and manage any that jump in after that, that's probably the way I would go. Especially with a young forest, it's really easy to shoot out the interior of a fence block as well. Or if you've had a block that's had deer damage, it's quite open underneath, and we can pretty easily shoot out the interior. So I think fences are a big tool, but as you say, deer get really smart after a period of time. They hear that helicopter coming and they just jump straight into the bush. So for me, I'm going, okay, I want to use my helicopter, ideally a fence, then I'll use an indicator dog with ground hunters, and then I'll roll through with that thermal scope so you can pick off those really smart ones or twos. Some of the helicopter guys are rolling thermals now, and that's a really good tool as well. But I'd go helicopters, ground hunting, thermal scope from a distance. That's my favorite.
All pretty expensive stuff though, eh?
It is and it's not, eh? So you're right. Like a deer fence is around $35 to $45 a meter, which is, I mean, we've priced up some of our farms over here, and for a 2,000 hectare farm, a complete perimeter fence around that farm's $500,000. It's pretty expensive, and it's pretty unattainable for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But we're talking about how much dollars are we going to get off that forest over its lifespan. So are you better to invest now or invest later? If you invest now, does that reduce your maintenance and your ongoing control bill? With a fence, it definitely will. It's just whether it pays for itself over time, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And I find jumping traps like a really fascinating tool. Have you seen jumping traps, Jimmy?
I've never seen them, no.
They're pretty cool, eh? They're like two swinging gates, and you leave the top one open, and the deer can jump in, and then you shut it, and you can go and mop up anything that's jumped in. And we're getting 150 off some of the back paddocks on farms using jumping traps in the morning. So
In the
they're
morning.
really in the morning. And you get the same again next week. So they're a really effective way, particularly in winter, where you identify those little grassy areas next to your bush block, and you build a trap around those, and that's a productive part of the farm that they'll just keep jumping into.
And so what are you putting inside them for a lure?
It's just grass. It's just feed, eh, Jimmy? So, like, if you've got a jumping trap next to a bush block and they're living in the bush block and then jumping into the grassy paddock next door, or they're great on those borders between forestry or public conservation lands on your back grassy paddock, because you'll actually be sucking them out because they will be feeding on that grass in your paddock. So they're real useful to it, reducing deer across a large landscape.
Yeah.
And the other one's helicopter shooting. Very expensive, but if you can do that in a area and you can do it across multiple properties at a similar time, like if you can get together with your neighbors or with DOC or the forestry and do it all at the same time, particularly if they're using a thermal, you can knock a whole lot of deer out of your system really fast and give yourselves a big knockdown, and then you'll just be maintaining after that if you keep the pressure on. So it's just about doing the cost analysis and seeing how much dollars you're getting out of your carbon credits and what level of deer control it pays for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
And probably investing in our forest's future, I'd say.
Yeah, and doing things like fencing, it helps in so many ways, not just with pest control, doesn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, you talked about thermals briefly there.
And they can be as inexpensive as a couple of thousand for a really good one. And, you know, if we're thinking about, you know, $2,000, and one person can do a lot of control with a thermal. So if we're thinking about $2,000 versus a fence or $2,000 versus a helicopter, it becomes really inexpensive for a very for a tool we can use ourselves, which is a lot of fun, because most of us will like to get out for a little hunt here or there, or we'll have someone, a mate who does, or kids that do. And a thermal's just a really easy way of increasing their numbers that they're able to take out of a block, particularly when you've got an establishing forest that doesn't have that strong canopy cover just yet, because those thermals can penetrate that and find deer that we can never see.
Yeah, wicked tool, eh? Cool.
And that's, yeah, I just want to come back to those couple of key principles about rolling through different methodologies, ideally establishing a fence around the outside, moving away from recreational hunting, our thinking being, hey, we got a couple of mates that come through every year and they keep on top of the deer for us. They will to some degree, but what we're really interested in is keeping the deer down to pretty close to nothing, so that we can get those large podocarp species through into our forest canopy. Because once they're established, you can actually allow the deer to come back to some degree if you need to, but we really need them established to sequester as much carbon as we possibly can.
Yeah, yeah. Well, then bringing back the hoodoo, which you referred to before, eh? That's awesome.
It's the key. It's the key to having a long-term productive forest, is having those big rangatira rako as in the system, having those less valuable species that add some diversity in the mid layers, and then having that hoodoo layer that's creating a forest floor that's super productive and rich in nutrients. Yeah, I reckon that's the key to a healthy forest, in my opinion.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And I think like a lot of people are less educated on that bottom layer. So it's cool that you're so passionate about that bit. And it's, yeah, super special. Cool. Yeah, a bit more, if you're after a bit more information on how CarbonCrop works and how CarbonCrop can support, we've got a huge amount of information and blog posts on our website. So yeah, definitely jump on there.